When the spotlights went dark, no one noticed. Arnold held his breath and felt that the sentence he had hidden for years was about to change everything. In Graz's foggy mornings, the cold tapping at the window couldn't put out the warmth inside Arnold. The muscles on the torn magazine pages pinned to his wall were not just aesthetics, but an escape plan. But there was still something he didn't know. His father meant discipline, but for young Arnold, discipline wasn't a stick. It was the small victories etched into a calendar. Every push-up a letter, every pull-up a word, and in the end, a body written as fluently as a new language. But there was still something he didn't know. The fake bronze tans and stage lights in the American magazines wouldn't fit into Austria's narrow corridors. The voice echoing in his mind said, "One day, you'll be there." But there was still something he didn't know. The first time he stepped on stage, the noise of his body didn't drown out the whisper of the child inside. No one saw the truth waiting behind the mirror, and with every pose he made himself another promise. But there was still something he didn't know. As magnesium dust rose like a cloud in the halls of the 1970s, he looked for victory, not in a muscle group, but in strategy, to wear down a rival's strongest pose early and claim the stage at the most critical moment. But there was still something he didn't know. Clenched fists, smiling lips, arrogance crammed into photographs. Yet, alone in the wings, there was a short sentence he murmured in an Austrian accent, "Today, I keep my word." But there was still something he didn't know. When he landed in Los Angeles, the sun was the same, but the shadows were longer. Languages, streets, contracts were foreign, and he treated every foreignness like a muscle to be memorized. But there was still something he didn't know. When the first role offer came, the director said, "Your accent is too heavy." And Arnold nodded. The heavy thing wasn't his accent. It was the weight people assign to dreams. But there was still something he didn't know. As the Terminator's single line circled the globe, most of the kids who memorized it never knew the training Arnold did in silence before he spoke it. But there was still something he didn't know. Fame looks like a staircase, but is often a slippery ramp. Arnold learned to run on the ramp, to pay the price quietly, and to get up when he fell. But there was still something he didn't know. While newspapers hailed you a hero one day and searched for flaws the next, he drew chalk lines so that public mistakes could become private truths. The boundaries were clear, the responsibility heavy, but there was still something he didn't know. Entering politics was like doubling the weight on the bar. Between the people's expectations and the cold math of the budget, sometimes even a gram too much could make the country ache. But there was still something he didn't know. As the security guards approached, Arnold changed the last sentence of his speech, and the silence in the hall first swelled, then turned into a whisper. In the governor's mansion, one narrow night a door opened. The file the advisor brought in held not only numbers but tomorrow's headlines set to paper. But there was still something he didn't know. Environmental policy was like breath control in the gym. Demanding quick results empties the oxygen, rhythmic patience wins the long distance. But there was still something he didn't know. People look for perfection in a leader. He chose to wear his flaws like a chain around his neck and use them as weight. But there was still something he didn't know. A letter came from a young man. "I'm afraid of the stage lights." Arnold wrote back, "Don't fear the light, fear being unprepared." The day that young man stepped on stage, only one person in the crowd didn't tremble. But there was still something he didn't know. Rewinding his own life, he decided the true hero was always the me of tomorrow. If today's muscle doesn't carry tomorrow's promise, it's only a picture. But there was still something he didn't know. One day the studio phone rang. The voice was familiar, but the message was entirely different. The shadow of the past was returning with a new test. But there was still something he didn't know. When Arnold answered the phone, the first word he heard reminded him of a vow from years ago, and all his plans changed. Years later, he took the stage as a narrator this time. He shared not the sentences of his victories, but the verbs of his mistakes. The hall found a new rhythm of applause in the courage of confession. But there was still something he didn't know. He didn't hide the lines behind his smile. The wrinkles were medals time had given him, each containing a lesson to be passed to someone young. but there was still something he didn't know. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see an icon, but a student repeating the course. Starting from zero every day was the greatest secret of a career, but there was still something he didn't know. On the closing day, he walked alone backstage. He placed his hand on the wall, took a deep breath and remembered the window in Austria, the sun in Los Angeles, and the night in the governor's office all at once. But there was still something he didn't know. When he stepped on stage, he said this final line, "Conquer yourself, the rest follows." The crowd stood and he heard a small child inside him smiling quietly. But there was still something he didn't know. As the curtain fell, an envelope was extended. There was no name on it, only a short sentence. "You kept your word." In that moment, he understood the road was actually just beginning. But there was still something he didn't know. When the door opened, what he saw whispered that the next chapter of the story had already been written. That morning, as he wiped the fog from the window with his finger, a word fell from inside him. Order. Order was the socket where dreams get plugged in, but there was still something he didn't know. The lines in his training log were as strict as mathematics. On days that read chest plus back, he probed the harmony of opposing muscles like languages. But there was still something he didn't know. The hardest moment of a pre-contest diet isn't hunger. It's when memories rise. The scent of childhood sits at the table, and you politely show it a seat. But there was still something he didn't know. As he stepped to the podium, the sound of the crowd melted into a single hum. That hum was the snare of the same melody that had played in his mind for years. But there was still something he didn't know. As a bead of sweat rolled down his cheek under the stage lights, the accountant working in the back room of his mind counted pose durations, second by second. But there was still something he didn't know. When one of his rivals caught his gaze in the mirror, a sudden calm formed within him. Rather than seeing the rival, he saw the gap in his strategy. But there was still something he didn't know. In award night photos, his smile was wide, but a small muscle twitched at his jaw. Tomorrow had another weight waiting there. But there was still something he didn't know. On the set of his first film, it wasn't when the camera said rolling, but when silence was required that he discovered the existence of a new muscle group, patience. But there was still something he didn't know. In the scene where the stuntman broke down the door, what stood behind it wasn't the role. It was his own past, and even the director's cut couldn't stop it. But there was still something he didn't know. When a journalist asked, "Why did you enter politics?" his answer was as simple as a predicate. Because sometimes the weight is yours to lift. But there was still something he didn't know. In budget meetings, numbers are as unforgiving as the lines in a gym mirror. Applause doesn't come unless the right pose, the right cut, and the right time come together. But there was still something he didn't know. In an environmental report, a tiny footnote under the chart changes the whole picture. Like a small scratch backstage, if it's missed, it bleeds on stage. But there was still something he didn't know. As the headlines of scandals grew larger in the papers, there were smaller but heavier words on a table at home. Apology, responsibility, repair. But there was still something he didn't know. The crowd sometimes judges a single moment in a person's life, but few remember how many thousands of minutes of sweat preceded that moment. But there was still something he didn't know. One afternoon, after a bench press session, Arnold racked the bar and drew a single line in his notebook. The meaning was simple: "Today I kept my word." But there was still something he didn't know. In the first years of immigration, he rewired his tongue with muscle memory. Rolling words in the mouth is like lowering a dumbbell under control. Rush it and you get hurt. But there was still something he didn't know. On that rainy day, he entered through the studio's back door. Amid the smell of carpet and the drone, rehearsals for his fate were taking place on the other side of the wall. But there was still something he didn't know. When a director said no, he translated it as "not yet." He counted rejection as the warm-up for the next set. But there was still something he didn't know. Among the explosions of action scenes, he focused his ear on the truly quiet thing, the audience's breath-holding moment. That's where an invisible contract is signed. But there was still something he didn't know. When he spoke in congressional halls, he increased the weight of his sentences by reducing the number of words. Excess is dead weight in both muscle and politics. But there was. Among the explosions of action scenes, he focused his ear on the truly quiet thing, the audience's breath-holding moment. That's where an invisible contract is signed. But there was still something he didn't know. When he spoke in congressional halls, he increased the weight of his sentences by reducing the number of words. Excess is dead weight in both muscle and politics. But there was still something he didn't know. Instead of trying to cram his mistakes into a press release, he first tried to fit them in the mirror. The mirror's language is harsh, but its translation is clear. But there was still something he didn't know. A mentor told him, "Prepare your best self for your worst day." So he wrote not only victories on the calendar, but the probable falls as well. But there was still something he didn't know. He sat with young people at charities. He liked the quiet one most, because silence is sometimes the loudest shout. But there was still something he didn't know. He carried a small note card backstage. "Start with a whisper, the noise comes on its own." That sentence was the silent key to every new chapter. But there was still something he didn't know. Sometimes a mistake doesn't end a career. It only ends the laziness inside it. What's at stake isn't the finish. It's moving the starting line. But there was still something he didn't know. In the heaviest hour of the night during his governor days, a street lamp flickered on the city map. A small flicker can turn the direction of a big decision. But there was still something he didn't know. When he read that document, the pen on the table rolled, and the night flowed in a new direction. Of all the rivals he faced over the years, the strongest was the tired look in the mirror. When he smiled at that look, victory was already half sure. But there was still something he didn't know. During a documentary shoot, the director paused at the last question. "Regret?" Arnold answered with a single word. "Lesson." But there was still something he didn't know. A small signature on the environment could sway a young person's big decision. Sometimes the small signatures in politics last longer than the big applause in halls. But there was still something he didn't know. In a quiet room at home, he kept an old piece of iron. It was a reminder, cold enough to grasp the truth, heavy enough to warm the dream. But there was still something he didn't know. He ran, he fell, he got up, he continued. Short sentences kept time like blows within a long breath. But there was still something he didn't know. A simple question in an interview could catch him unprepared. So he prepared hard answers for simple questions. But there was still something he didn't know. What people call luck, he called preparation catching timing. Those who learn to wake before the alarm hear coincidences more clearly. But there was still something he didn't know. In the middle of his career, he tried starting from zero once more. Zero isn't the number of defeat, it's the number of clarity. But there was still something he didn't know. When a young weightlifter asked him, "How do you focus?" he said, "Now." Now is the heaviest weight. But there was still something he didn't know. A letter asked, "Do my mistakes define me?" He took the pen. They describe you, but they don't define you. But there was still something he didn't know. A scene on set was shot 5 times. On the 6th, no one noticed. But before looking at the camera, he closed his eyes for a moment. In that instant, he reset the metronome inside. But there was still something he didn't know. One decision in the governor's office changes a city's morning. A city's morning mixes into thousands of cups of coffee. The coffee carries the flavor of the decision, but there was still something he didn't know. On a podcast, he smiled when he said the word success. Success is sometimes singing the wrong song correctly. The real issue is finding the right song. But there was still something he didn't know. In the silence of night, the cold of iron burned his palm. What scorches isn't the iron, it's the ghosts of the workouts you skipped. But there was still something he didn't know. On the long road, an old song played on the radio. A line flickered between his lashes like a spark. Conquer yourself. But there was still something he didn't know. An assistant knocked on the studio door and asked a tiny detail. Small details swallow big crises, as long as you notice them in time. but there was still something he didn't know.